So what happened is I realized I was told stuff at school. I remember one day a teacher saying to me, Jamie, if you do not start to try harder, you will simply drive a van for a living. And I remember thinking, how dare he? Like, what's wrong with driving a van for a living? You know, my dad was a demolition worker, got in a van every morning. But I just thought, what a crap attitude to have towards a young child. But I remember that afternoon or within minutes of that teacher saying it, thinking, I won't drive a van for a living. I'll employ a bunch of people that drive vans for a living. So I just knew it was almost that was a pivotal moment in my life that I thought, just because I'm not, because at that stage I just thought I wasn't bright. I just thought I wasn't able. I thought just because I'm not as bright as everybody else doesn't mean I'm going to be poor. Right.
Jamie, you're very, very welcome back to the ScaleX Insider podcast. Delighted and thrilled to be speaking with you again today.
Oh, and just a big thank you from me for having me once again. And likewise, I've been looking forward to this morning.
Oh, well, look, I'm delighted to have you back. You're one of the very, very few guests that we brought back for a second time. I've been listening back to your conversation a few times since we first spoke back in July of last year, and there was so much in that we wanted to dive into, but we couldn't explore around your dyslexia. And I'm delighted that you have finally written your book. You're about to publish it. The published date is on the 12th of September, just for the benefit of our listeners. So huge congratulations. Well done.
Oh, thank you so much. And as you know, when we last spoke, I would have been sort of right in the mix of it. So it's been a long sort of 18 months to 2 years, but it's really nice to have pressed go. The book now sits with the distributors and it's available for pre-order across the world in all formats. And it's now that, I get to enjoy the process now, which is talking about it and engaging with people like you and your audience.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, look, we're going to get into that deeply today. As you know, our tradition in this show is to pose this question to all of our guests. You know, our vision is to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of small and medium-sized enterprises to scale with purpose. So, Jamie, once again, what does scaling with purpose mean to you?
Actually, I've been giving this question a bit more thought, wanting to not just repeat myself from last time. And one of the things that really sticks out in mind at the moment, Brendan, excuse me, is this using a quote from President Obama, which is to be useful. And it's something that I've been talking a lot about recently with some of the CEOs that work in the portfolio of companies that I run, which is a lot of I think people get quite stuck in almost becoming an advisor to themselves these days, and they're procrastinating. They sit and they talk about, well, what I will do or what I should do or what I could do. And actually it's about getting stuff done. And that's what having a purpose is about getting up in the morning and being action orientated. And I think what people will find is if they get into that action orientated environment, then they will be successful at whatever they put their minds to.
Yeah, I love that, and that is different from the last time, but it's so succinct and very poignant. I understand your purpose and then lean into it. Just take action on that purpose and be useful to the world. I love that.
Yeah.
Look, the Dyslexic Edge. When we spoke the last time, I was delighted that you had written this, and I wasn't sure whether I disclosed it or not because since then my daughter has actually released her own podcast called Not So Typical. So. Uh, Anya disclosed the fact publicly that she has high functioning autism and certainly was challenged with that, being neurodivergent, operating in a neurotypical world. You have written a book primarily targeted at business leaders. So, look, what inspired you to write The Dyslexic Edge?
Well, I mean, we should start. So I was born with dyslexia, ADHD, colorblind, and poor. So I really had to work hard to make a success of myself. And the reality is that childhood through schooling and stuff was not only tough, but it was horrible for me. So I always had this hang up of how I'd been treated through life, mainly in the education system. But the reality is, Brendan, that I hid it. I became a master at disguising my dyslexia, whether it be scruffy handwriting. You know, I grew up in an environment where your doctor had the world's worst handwriting. So scruffy handwriting didn't mean that you were thick, but not being able to spell did. So what I did is I disguised my writing to be so scruffy that you couldn't work out if I'd spelt it incorrectly or not, because I was petrified of people discovering that I had this weakness, which I later on found out to be dyslexia. But what happened is, fast forward when I met my now wife, Madeline. So I'm sort of mid-30s, and I met Madeline, who was dyslexic. And Madeline came from, she went to a private fee-paying boarding school, went on to university, got a great degree, ended up working as an art buyer in art history. And I realized that, hang on, I shouldn't be ashamed of this anymore. It could happen to anybody. And I can only describe it as coming out. It was like I had hidden this thing for so many years that when I finally came out and I was able to say, by the way, I'm dyslexic, my whole world changed. Everything improved around me because I could now just lean on people for help. And when I realized the change in my own quality of life that happened around that time, it just became really evident for me that we needed to change the narrative of dyslexia. Changing the narrative of dyslexia is almost more important than trying to change the schooling system, because the change in dyslexia needs to happen in stages. And something that I believe I could influence is to change the narrative that it's not a disability. And if in fact, it's nothing more than a difference in learning. And it is a difference. It's not a difficulty, it's a difference. The whole learning system was created for 85% of the population, not 100% of the population. So that was the general inspiration. And then I was really fortunate that I happened to be spending some time with one of the most famous dyslexics on the planet, so Richard Branson. And Richard and I were on a bike ride one day, and we were actually spending a lot of time talking about sleep and the connections between sleep disorders and dyslexia, and more importantly, sleep, or not more importantly, but more valid as sleep disorders and ADHD. And Richard and I were talking about this and talking about dyslexia in the main. And Richard's daughter went to school with my wife, and it got onto the subject of dyslexia and books. And the reality is, I like to say this, Brendan, that dyslexic people like to read too. The difference is dyslexic people read books because they simply want to get the content out. They want to know what information is in there. You won't find a dyslexic person take a book and go and sit underneath a tree in a park for the day, where you will find a non-dyslexic person to do that. So what was a surprise to me is that when you looked at the literature on dyslexia, it was mainly written by academics. Well, those with dyslexia were never going to read it. So I wanted it to be case study led. I wanted it to be written by those with dyslexia. So I decided to write the book myself, but also feature 13 other successful dyslexic in the main entrepreneurs. And they range from the interior designer Kelly Hoppin, Theo Petitus, Duncan Ballantyne, Sir Charles Dunstan, the print billionaire Paul Orfler. So I got a great bunch of people together to share their stories.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I never knew that, and it makes sense, of course, that you wouldn't take a book and kind of go and make yourself a coffee and just read for enjoyment.
Mm.
As It's one of my real pleasures in life, like just sitting down to read a book. I read a lot, obviously. Hosting the podcast gives me the privilege of interviewing wonderful people like yourself, Jamie, and reading their work, and I do that for pleasure.
Yeah.
But it never dawned on me that you guys just read purely for the knowledge that's contained within the books. I want to go back to something, because you shared with us the moment where you felt that dyslexia could empower your life and not disempower your life. But what had happened, because you weren't born with the knowledge that you had dyslexia. So what was happening for you to determine or conclude or tell yourself that this thing that I have in terms of not being able to spell was actually something that's going to limit me in life? What was happening for you to conclude that and create this limiting belief system within yourself?
It's a great question because I mean, what happened if I look back to primary school, so sort of, from nursery age 3 to age 11, I was a really popular boy, and I had a great bunch of friends in my school, and and then all of a sudden, the scoring system in schools went from effort to attainment, and I think that was a pivotal moment where I went from getting A's and if I look at my children now, one is 8 and one is 7. My 7-year-old will get a certificate once a week for her table manners or for her putting her hand up in class. My 8-year-old might get a certificate once a year for her efforts. So the school system has a very hard cutoff date around when and how they reward people. Now, I've only witnessed it since having children myself, but now I think back to my childhood, and that definitely happened. So what happened is then I started to be segregated from my friends because my friends were clearly more able in the learning environment than I was. And that made me go withdraw for a while and feel less of a person. But then all of a sudden, what I started to do is I started to realize that if I still wanted to maintain these friends, I had to become more of the class clown. I had to become the person who entertained them, the person who could tell jokes. And I found that was a great process to keeping my friends through those last few years of primary school. But when the damage really happened is when you go from primary school to secondary school, because you sit a bunch of tests and they award you your school system based upon where you live and what grades you get. And my friends, for whatever reason, the friends that I had built my association with that were so close were simply better at learning than me. So they all went off to a school called Rains Foundation, which is a school I wanted to go to, and they got in their first choice of school, and I got in my third school. So, and you only get 3 choices, obviously. So I got in the worst school. So I went to an all boys school full of people that either had learning difficulties or were disruptive and didn't want to learn, etc., etc. And my friends went to a very good school where people went with the right attitude, and that was a real shock to me. So I went from being a good, well-liked young boy into a boys' school where I was severely bullied for 7 to 8 months because I turned up wanting to learn and wanting to be this bright-eyed, bushy-haired young boy. And then I became the bully because it was the only way I worked out to deal with it. But if you look back at all this, dyslexia played a pivotal part in all of it. The way I was treated through my schooling created so many different personalities in myself until I managed to get out of the school system age 16. And I left the school system before sitting any GCSEs and went straight into the working environment.
Yeah, and we touched on this the last time, the way you were able to change your persona, the way you're able to adapt your identity. I mean, the way you're speaking now, when I first heard you speak, I had already these assumptions made that you went to a private school, that you're clearly from a wealthy background. This guy's impeccable, the way he presents, the way he speaks. And it was such a shock to me to hear that, no, I flunked school. I was told I was disruptive, and I spoke in a very, very different way, a thick Cockney accent, and I had to change this accent and ultimately change my identity if I wanted to be successful. I'm curious to understand, for me, when I went through school, I associated getting good grades with getting with doing well in business. It sounds to me you didn't have that association. It seems like you've had an entrepreneurial career from a very, very young age. So you share with me a little bit of insight about how you felt that going ahead in school wasn't going to impede me in terms of actually developing a career in business.
Yeah, so it had the opposite effect on me. So what happened is I realized I was told stuff at school. Like, I remember one day a teacher saying to me, Jamie, if you do not start to try harder, you will simply drive a van for a living. And I remember thinking, how dare he? Like, what's wrong with driving a van for a living? You know, my dad was a demolition worker, got in a van every morning. But I just thought, what a crap attitude to have towards a young child. But I remember that afternoon, or within minutes of that teacher saying it, thinking, I won't drive a van for a living. I'll employ a bunch of people that drive vans for a living. So I just knew it was almost, that was a pivotal moment in my life that I thought, just because I'm not, because at that stage I just thought I wasn't bright. I just thought I wasn't able. I thought just because I'm not as bright as everybody else doesn't mean I'm going to be poor. So I very quickly got this purpose in life that I was going to, one, work for myself, and two, prove everybody wrong. And that second one, you know, going back to your initial question on purpose, my single purpose, and a lot of people don't like to talk about this, but my single purpose as a young entrepreneur was not to be poor, was to be rich, because I grew up in a two-bedroom flat above a shop in Bethnal Green, and I didn't want that life for myself. So, and that was quite a strong purpose to have, of course. And you, as you mentioned about my accent and stuff, one of the things I do, you know, I'm very forgiving in life. I don't hold any grudges, but one of the things that still grates at me a little bit is, as you mentioned, that I changed my accent on purpose. So you're right, I sound like I went to school with my wife. And the reality is I didn't. And I did a TV show when I was very young, age 16. And if you watch that TV show back, I was as Cockney as they come. But I purposefully changed the way I speak because I thought that it would, it was my disguise in my dyslexia, it was disguised in my inability. I thought if I talked like a Cockney, they would think I'm not very bright. And then if they dug a bit deeper, they would realize I'm not very bright. So all of these things played into me having to change. But I was always very, very confident from a young age that I would, one, work for myself, and that I would, two, have plenty full of money.
Where did that belief come from?
I was very fortunate that I grew up with my mum and dad. I had half brothers and sisters, but mum and dad lived at home. My dad wasn't great. He was an alcoholic, and wasn't a great father figure, but he always put money on the table for mum and I to have a fairly normal life. My mother was absolutely exceptional. She just told me every day that I was great, that I was brilliant, that whenever I failed, she would give me a reason for it, that it wasn't my fault. And mum always had a saying that I repeat quite often, which is love and confidence is all a child needs to succeed. And I honestly, hand on heart, believe in that. She just gave me so much confidence in myself that it was difficult. I never ever doubted myself, not age 7, not age 14, not age 45 now. I've never doubted that if I put my mind to something, I could achieve it.
What do you say to your two beautiful daughters now, Emily and Allegra, to support them in strengthening their belief system around their capability and their potential in life?
Well, I follow that exact strategy of my mother's, which is, you know, to make sure that they wholeheartedly believe in themselves, because I'm a strong believer that confidence will drive better outcomes. So it's difficult, obviously, because they're in a much different position than I was growing up. You know, they do go to one of the best schools in the country, and they have they witness a very, very different life. But you know, I talk to them about. I'm very open and transparent with my children. Actually, I think that's what I'm looking to. That's the answer I'm looking for. My children are very aware of my childhood, my parents' lives, my hardships, and how I have worked my way out of them. So, and what I try to do is make sure that I they can witness that in their own childhood. So I was also part of a motorcycle charity from age 5 to 16, which was for disadvantaged children from East London. So I spent 11 years at a charity every weekend being looked after by sort of social workers, I guess. And I'm still a major sponsor of that charity, and my children do a lot of work around that too, which is, you know, these little children from East London, how can they become something brilliant? And that something brilliant might be to become the next teacher, to become the next nurse. It doesn't mean to become a multimillionaire, but it means to become something different than what the path has already set out for them.
Ah, that's brilliant. You mentioned, and you speak beautifully about your mum. Is she still with us, by the way?
She's not, unfortunately. They've both passed,
Oh,
and yeah, a bit too soon. But we had a great time together.
good. You speak about the love that your mum brought, the confidence that she instilled in you. You also talk about the openness you have with your own kids, the transparency you have. Those sound to me like wonderful virtues to bring into business. You've started, scaled, and sold multiple businesses. Have you brought virtues of love, which almost seems, you know, uh, paradoxical to running a successful business? Or we don't talk about love. What are you talking about? I'm a Cockney guy. Yeah, this worked whenever I was a child, but no, no, no. Business is something different. Have you brought love into the working environment? How do you instill confidence in the hundreds of people that have been being present to your leadership? How do you create openness? How do you create transparency? Or is that just something you contain within the parental home?
No, it's a great question. So one of the things that I'm always saying to people now, people ask me, very much on podcasts, oh well, if you could give one bit of advice to your younger self or et cetera, et cetera. And my response is always the same now, and it is to be kind. And it's something I carry with me every day. And I've not always been fortunate enough to realize that, a younger Jamie would have walked over, ex-partners, some staff, some business partners, some romantic partners to simply achieve what I wanted to achieve. And what I've realized as I've matured through life is that there is absolutely no reason for that. That's what the media portrays as the entrepreneur on the old TV shows like EastEnders and Coronation Street, and some people feel that to be successful, you have to do that. And for me, it's about being kind and showing respect to people in both business environment, personal environment, and everywhere else you can be.
Yeah, and for those who aren't aware, one of your former businesses was debt collecting. So this isn't a case that you were running a flower shop, and love and kindness is important in that context. I mean, you were in one of the toughest businesses that you can imagine anyone to be in. So the fact that people are hearing this, and I say it because I interviewed a cardiologist recently, and we were talking about 7 traits of the heart. He written a book. Dr. Jonathan Fisher released a book called Just One Heart, and the how we leverage the heart in the context of leadership. And I've interviewed so many incredible people who have scaled billion-dollar companies, and the message is consistent here in terms of the love and kindness to the people that who are supporting you in executing your vision. You mentioned something right at the outset in terms of the label that you were given as not being bright. That's clearly not the case. What other misconceptions about dyslexia to neurotypical people typically hold?
Well, I think the main one is that it equals low IQ, and the reality is it just simply is untrue. And in my book, we interview, for example, there's a chap called Edward who's now a venture capital partner at Octopus Ventures, and Ed is dyslexia, had the support that he needed to get with dyslexia, and but with that support, went all the way through to Oxford and got an MBA. So if someone with dyslexia with the right learning tools can get an MBA from one of the most prestigious universities in the world, then I think it's a clear sign that, yeah, it's the biggest thing that people just assume that if you've got dyslexia, you've got low IQ, and it is quite the opposite. One of the things about dyslexia is and I like to keep reminding people of this, it's just a useful title for someone to have given it. So in the book, I work with Dr. Helen Taylor, who's been doing some wonderful groundbreaking research that was published last year, and she's going on to do some more testing of now, which is the reality of dyslexia is that people are born into two groups in the world, either explorers or exploiters. 15% of the population are born explorers, and 85% are born exploiters. Now, if you go back to a few hundred years ago, it was really important for explorers. You know, go back 1,000 years. The explorers were going to find new land, find food, going to push the boundaries, and the exploiters were turning that into something when they brought it back. Well, these explorers are the people that don't learn in traditional fashion, like the 85% do. Now, if you think about how the learning system.
Rob, we've lost Jamie. Hello, Rob?
Benny, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, yeah, I think, yeah, Jamie's frozen.
Yeah, we've lost him.
I wonder if it might be worth just stopping the recording.
Yep.
Just so that we preserve what we've got.
Wait, let me hit this. There we go.
So one of the things we realized when, I chose to write this book with Dr. Helen Taylor, who's a professor at Cambridge and has been researching this subject for some time. And we realized that dyslexia is nothing more than a useful title to give people that just learn differently, because what her research suggests is that 15% of the population are born explorers and 85% exploiters. Now, if you think back to before learning existed, sort of 500 years ago, that was really useful because exploiters were there to go and find new land, go and find food and bring this stuff back. But the majority were the exploiters to then make this into something good. So prior to reading and writing, somebody who didn't learn in the same way as the 85% was hugely celebrated. These people were heroes. They were going out exploring, taking risks. But then came along this whole process of learning, in the main created by the church. And the church created it because they didn't want to lose knowledge gain. People were only living until sort of age 30 to 40 at this stage. And the church were petrified of losing the stories of God and the Bible. So what they did is they came out with this process of reading and writing. So we created this innovation called learning. And the reality is that it was right for 85% of the population, not right for 100% of the population. And the 15% of the population that it's not right for, those that we now call dyslexic, are the explorers in society. And that's why the statistics pin so well to entrepreneurship, because exploration pins so well to entrepreneurship. And the statistics talk for themselves, right? 35% of all entrepreneurs dyslexic, 40% of self-made millionaires. So what I would like to see in the future is we could actually get to a society where the whole term dyslexia is simply forgotten because it's meaningless.
I love this, and I recall interviewing Alex Osterwalder, and he mapped the journey from starting, scaling, and selling, and he talked about the startup phase being the explorer phase and the scale up phase being the exploiting phase. And actually, when we spoke the last time, you're a serial entrepreneur, but you love the startup. What you had said to me the last, you really enjoy the startup phase, but actually when it gets to a certain size, kind of 30-40 million pounds in value, you kind of start to lose interest when it gets into really, it gets heavy into that exploit phase. Does that ring true then?
It's absolutely true. So I'm a glutton for punishment, right? I'm the startup guy. So I'm on my fourth startup. You're right. I try to build them to a value of 30 to 40 million and then exit them. And then I do it all again. But for me, it's how I'm wired. It's what I love. It's what I enjoy. I'm an explorer. I'm curious. And I like, and because of my explorative nature, I'm also action orientated, which means I can get stuff done. You know, I'm useful to myself. But once it gets to that exploiting stage, when we're into, you know, which is crazy, people go to me, why are you selling another business, Jamie? You're now making 20% a year on year growth in EBITDA margins. You're employing a couple of hundred people. And I'm like, but I'm not finding it fun anymore. And that's been so great in working with Helen on this book, is to really get some understanding on why that might be. But if you think of some of the best inventions in the world, light, flight, the iPhone, all from dyslexic thinkers. And if you think about climate change and resolving that, the reality is it's probably going to be a dyslexic thinker that does that.
My head's spinning over here because Simple Scaling is obviously in startup mode. I left having been the CEO of a business that we scaled significantly, scaled that business across 6 continents, from 15 people to 700 people. I love that phase. It's the startup phase that I'm not enjoying. So I need a Jamie on board to navigate through this phase to get into the exploiting phase.
And this is why partnerships are so successful, right? If you find the right business partner to do business with. So I'm unfortunate that I've never found that. I've always been a bit of a lone warrior. So I set up the businesses, employ management teams, give them some equity, and then they take it on to be the bigger organization that it will be. But actually, you know, I was with someone at the weekend having lunch who's a senior partner at Deloitte, and he's such an ideas person, and he's got amazing business ideas. But I'm like, ideas are cheap, right? Execution is expensive. Now, if I could find somebody to put him with, I know that he would be a great entrepreneur, and all he wants to do is leave Deloitte and become an entrepreneur. That's his life passion. But at the moment, he's just the ideas guy. So, and I'm with you, but it's really difficult. You can't simply go, well, you're good at this, you're good at that. Off you go together, because there's too much other stuff that plays part in that.
Yeah, of course.
The successful partnerships are, without a doubt, you know, one of the things, entrepreneurship is quite lonely, right? And I would have thought, I've not seen anybody do anything around this, and maybe it's something that somebody should pick up on, but trying to create more entrepreneurship partners. There's a business idea there somewhere that I've just picked up while talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier you had the great opportunity, the wonderful opportunity of spending time with Sir Richard Branson. I had the privilege of hosting Richard Branson's business partner, Jean Olwang, on the show, who wrote the wonderful book called Partnering. And she has created a framework as to how we leverage partnerships. And of course, the 9th principle of her 10 principle ScaleX framework is focused on partnerships. And it's that leveraging the unique strength, the unique abilities of others to where 1 + 1 = 3. And ultimately, it's less than 0.5% of small and medium-sized enterprises now in the UK are actually achieving scale. And this is why it's so challenging, finding these people with these unique strengths and getting them to come together, align towards a common vision, and really leaning into that and taking action, throwing everything towards that. You mentioned Dr. Helen Taylor. She mentioned in your book, people with dyslexia have a learning specialization that is critical to human prosperity. Now that's a big statement. What does she mean by that?
Well, what she means by that is that they are explorative in nature. So they are the explorers versus the exploiters. So it's critical to human prosperity. 1,000 years ago, where if someone wasn't willing to go outside the safe walls of the camp to try and hunt for food, then people would have simply all just died together. And what she presents compelling evidence with through her research is that follows right through today with space exploration. You know, look at the neurodiversity within the space race at the moment between Elon Musk and Richard Branson. I'm not too sure of Blue Origin's neurodiversity traits. But the reality is that it's these individuals that are taking these big, bold, explorative moves, whether it be with their own money, with their own brands, with their own times. That sort of risk taking is taken by explorers who are in the main dyslexic thinkers. So for us to continue to find greener energies, resolve climate control, life outside of where we are today, the likelihood is it will be a dyslexic thinker, and the skills associated with dyslexic thinking are the skills that are required to do that. And going back to a few paragraphs ago when I said, if you think about light, the Wright brothers with flight, this was all dyslexic thinking. This was being able to go, well, what is the possible? What could be possible?
So on that, can those in the neurotypical world leverage these traits? Can we learn these traits? Can we learn to be less risk averse? Can we learn to be more curious? Can we learn to think differently through a dyslexic frame, or is it something just innate? But it's obviously innate to dyslexic thinkers, but can those in the neurotypical world learn this and leverage this for the benefits of their business?
So yes, and it was one of the main reasons for writing the book. Is at the end of each chapter, between Dr. Helen Taylor and I, we take the information from, say, Sir Charles Dunstan's career, because each chapter features one entrepreneur, and it gives a mini autobiography of their life story and how dyslexia has impacted them from childhood right through to where they are today. And then Helen and I take out the key prominent parts of that chapter, and we present dyslexic thinking tips. So what they did, what you might be able to do too. So yes, non-dyslexic people can action these actions. It's just not going to be natural to them. The same way it might not be natural for somebody to be polite to everybody. They might have a posted up on their wall saying, be nice to people, right? Be more nice to people. And it might be that you have to have a posted on your wall that says, be more explorative rather than exploiter every day. And to nudge you to start thinking like a dyslexic thinker. But yes, people can learn dyslexic thinking traits. We believe we have listed over 100 of them in the book that people can pick up and go, oh yeah, I could see how I could implement that in my own business or in my own personal life. But also, Brendan, I think it's really important, 20 years ago, I was convinced the power of diversity in senior management teams and boards. And I started to deliberately make sure that I had different looking and different feeling people across my businesses, female, male, non-white, white, etc., etc. I would like to see that go further into neurodiversity too. I think the boards and management teams and startup teams and project management teams might want to consider actively going out and recruiting and bringing in dyslexic thinkers.
Putting you on the spot here, when the last time we spoke, you had an investment portfolio within your own portfolio of 13 companies that there's probably increased since then. Do you actively bring in neurodiverse thinkers?
Well, actually, so that's an interesting question. So I would say that we don't actively bring in. Do we have them? Yes, but that's because it seems it's natural for me to gravitate towards those people. But it's an interesting question. Actually, I'm surprised that nobody's ever asked me that before. So no, we have never actively gone out and recruited for a dyslexic thinker. Can I think of any of the businesses in my portfolio? I probably can't think across all 13 in the next 10 seconds, but if I think about the ones that I own more than 75% of, I would say that we have neurodiversity at every senior management team across those businesses.
That's really, really wonderful. What are you really proud of? I'm trying to get an insight into the management teams of your portfolio companies. If I was sitting in a room, let's say in a board meeting, and I walked in and I was there for a few hours, what would I see that you're really proud of that isn't typical in other boardrooms?
We have proud of is an interesting term to use. So I think if you were to sit in one of our rooms, I'm very fortunate that I have a lot of meetings at home. So I invite my management teams to my home. We sit around my kitchen table. We have our meetings. I'll get out the pans. I'll make them some food while we're talking because I like it. I like them to feel. I like them to see me in my home environment. I think it adds a lot of value. But that does mean that my wife and children are around quite a lot. And my wife, on occasions, has said to me, "Oh, that was a really uncomfortable conversation today, wasn't it?" And I'm like, "Which one?" And she's like, "The one." And I'm like, "No, that's normal." So I think what I'm most proud of is that I think across all of my assets is that we can get in a room and we can be pretty tough on each other. And even me as the chair or the owner of the company, they will stand up to me, they will push back. I had a conversation with one of my CEOs the other day, and I said, "You will always get the answer you want because you have an amazing ability to wear me down. But on this occasion, I'm not going to allow that to happen." But that's the sort of relationship we have. And I think when you're the startup guy like I am, that's really important. We really don't have time to be considering what we might say to get our point across. We want to say it, we want to be brave about it, and we want people to respect that they're equally entitled to say things back in the same way. So I'm proud of that, but somebody external looking in might be a bit like, "Oh, that's a bit prickly." And it is on occasions, but it's what gets stuff done.
Yeah, I interviewed the author of the wonderful book Radical Candor, Kim Scott, and it sounds to me like radical candor just comes naturally to you in terms of bringing the right level of challenge, not taking things personally, challenging for the benefit of the organization, and all the while you're serving these guys food. So there's
Yeah.
no feeling that you've taken slight or taken anything personally as to what was said in the last 10 minutes. It seems to me like that's natural. Is that a consistent trait? If you think of the 100 traits across the dyslexic thinkers that you interviewed, is that something natural to them?
Yeah. What you find with dyslexic thinkers or explorers, as we now like to think of them, is that they're quite time poor in their mind because of the way their mind works. Their mind is very busy, their mind is very active, which means that they like to get to things very quickly. They don't like to, if you can get to your point in 3 words rather than 10, they would appreciate that. And actually, if you take 10 words on 10 occasions, they're likely to tell you to stop taking 10 words and use 3 words. And that's brilliant. But also they're very curious. To be an explorer, to be a dyslexic thinker makes you very curious. So they want more and more information, but it's got to be new information. What dyslexic thinkers get really bored of is you telling them something that they or somebody else already knows. They're really not interested in that. And that's obviously a typical exploiter's value, is to go, let me take information that's already known and let me exploit it. But for an explorer, for a dyslexic thinker, it sees that as useless information. It's like, yeah, great, but how about? So there's that sort of there's those mind games between explorers and exploiters in every meeting that you can see happen once you know about this research. It's wonderful to watch it play out.
I'm smiling as you say this. My daughter, who I mentioned at the outset, who has a podcast called Not So Typical to help neurodivergent teenage girls navigate the neurotypical world. And she wanted to call the podcast Fuck the Filter initially. And then we had a few conversations, said maybe that's not the best idea. But her idea of the worst situation that she can possibly in is in a line, in a queue to pay for something, and somebody ask her how the weather is or what she thinks about the weather. The weather conversation is just, she did an entire podcast on this. She cannot tolerate the kind of the soft conversations. It's just
Yeah.
ask me a question, a direct question, make sure it's direct, and I'll give you a very direct answer. And that's the way she engages.
And it's brilliant, right? And and you do need to remind yourself. I have to remind myself, especially with my wife, sometimes that because especially if you think about the female and male relationship, where females do like to talk more and they don't necessarily want a solution straight away, etc., etc. Well, then take the female and the dyslexic thinking male relationship, where it's everything that you hate. So I have to remind myself on many occasions that she doesn't want a solution, and she does want 30 words of your time, not just 3 words of your time. But it's quite a difficult one. But the great thing, or one thing I will say about dyslexic thinking, though, and people should remember it. A lot of people right now go, dyslexia is a superpower, and previously dyslexia was just seen as a disability. I don't buy into either one of them wholeheartedly. I think dyslexic thinking has a lot of positive attributes, but it is also an Achilles heel. There's not a day goes past that dyslexia doesn't affect me in some negative way. With that be get on the wrong train because I accidentally misread the platform sign, or embarrassed how I got something completely wrong when I stood up in front of somebody. There's always an Achilles heel to it. But more importantly, it's also quite exhausting. The dyslexic mind, and I need to be careful here because I'm also ADHD, so dyslexia and ADHD in specific makes me, it's a tiring environment. I'm switched on all day, and I don't sleep well either. So you've got to be mindful with dyslexic thinkers that they're taking a lot in, they're processing a lot, they're spitting a lot out all of the time. So sometimes their agitation or their frustration or their ability to cut across people and say, can you just get to the point, is not necessarily because that's how they feel. It's because their mind has just taken on too much information at this stage. And really, the human brain is designed to dump useless information to make way for new information, right? So can you imagine what that's like for the dyslexic human brain, where it believes that all information that has previously learned or exists is pretty much useless information. It's constantly in search for new information. Well, that's exhausting. So you do need to be aware of that when you're working with a dyslexic thinker, married to a dyslexic thinker, or have a child that's a dyslexic thinker, more importantly.
Yeah. As you say that, I think of a recent interview with the mindset mentor, Rob Dial, who cited that we receive up to 10 million bits of information per second. So the fact that you guys are taking this in, but searching for new bits within that, I can feel your exhaustion in that. I'm curious to understand what we can learn in terms of how you navigate the neurotypical world. You mentioned nudges a couple of times, little nudges. Have you nudges around the house in terms of, reminding yourself that, yeah, look, it's okay to have a casual conversation. I know I'm going into this scenario, so I need to be mindful of this, this, and this. Is there anything that you do to, I suppose, ground yourself, center yourself, and remind yourself that this is largely a neurotypical world, and if I approach it this way, I may not necessarily get the outcome that I want to get. So I need to remind myself actually to approach it this way.
Well, it's an interesting question, and one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on in the last 2 years, which is this idea of pay yourself first. And I don't mean pay your wages before you pay other people, but it's about looking after yourself first. So I'm very fortunate that I've always been into fitness, having been doing some sort of physical activity from a young boy. But that, or pay yourself first, is an important thing that I play out every day, which I ensure that I get up before the rest of the house, because as a dyslexic person with ADHD, I need some time alone. I just simply do. So I need to get out of bed before everybody else, and I need to exercise every day and have some time to myself. So I typically wake up between 5:30 and 6:30. And I generally get back to the house for breakfast time with my children. And I do have breakfast with my children before my wife takes them to school. But that pay yourself first is that first few hours of every single day of the week is dedicated to me, my personal well-being, and being a present husband and father. And what I find is that reminds me, those few hours remind me of what I need to do throughout the rest of my day to make sure that, because I've given myself this, I've been kind to myself, now I need to be kind to others. And, you know, we mentioned this a little while ago on the show. It's something that I pay a lot of attention to, which is being kind to people, not cutting them off, not telling them to say it in 3 words rather than 10. So I'm very much more thoughtful at that. But you can't ignore that I'm 45. I've run and sold and built many successful businesses. I've researched and written a book on the subject. So I'm quite well positioned to probably be better at it than most. But yes, of course, I have to prompt myself. You know, if I'm preparing for a meeting, and, you know, I'm very fortunate. Most of my meetings are just verbal. I don't need to read loads of reports and do lots of written content myself. But that doesn't mean that the page that I'm going to use in my notepad that I sort of fold a little bit on, it's got nothing written in it yet, but I folded it and I just write on it the key behavioral pattern for that meeting. So it might be that I know that, for example, Luke, the CEO of one of my organizations, the last meeting was a rough meeting for him. So I'll simply just have that blank page and one thing written on it, which is Luke needs to be the voice heard loudest. You know, and then that will set my scene for the meeting, because otherwise I won't remember, I'll get in and I'll get carried away. And so that I use prompts like that all of the time.
That's so profound. So what I'm hearing is you will really hone in on the emotional language, the emotional behavior, the body language of others in the meetings, and signal to yourself next time how you should potentially, let's say, compensate or address that, or be a little bit more compassionate in relation to maybe some of those behaviors which suggested that somebody was frustrated, angry, maybe didn't feel heard. I've never heard that before. That's very profound, and it's something that all leaders, not just the explorers out there, but all leaders can take note of, in terms of actually just noting within the room the the emotional temperature of those who are in the room, and
Yeah.
acknowledging that next time out.
And also, but you know, one of the things I've become very good at, I sold my first ever significant business to a large Japanese outsourcing firm. And during the deal process, I was told by the M&A advisors, this will never get over the line. The Japanese are terrible to deal with, et cetera, et cetera. So I went onto Amazon and I bought a book, How to Deal with Japanese Business People. And I read the book. And I made loads of notes in the book, and I got the deal through, and we sold to them, and they paid millions more than the next highest bidder. So it was great. But one of the things I learned in that process were the Japanese were very good at saying thank you and giving gifts or written notes. And it was constant. Every time I met the CEO of this organization, was worth about $4 billion based out in Japan, that bought my company. And every time I saw the CEO, he gave me a gift, he gave me a written note. And every time I went home from Japan, he gave me a gift to give to my wife. And it was just unbelievable how he was so focused on this. And I have followed that through in my life ever since, not with gifts, but with little notes, with thank yous. It might just be an email, but I'm very good at doing handwritten notes because I think they mean so much more. So, you know, the first time I ever met Richard Branson, we mentioned earlier on, you know, I was fortunate that I got to spend some time with him at his home. I wrote him a letter before I left, said goodbye to him, gave him a hug, gave him a little note, because I knew that I could say more in my note than I might say during our hug on the dock before I jump on a boat. I'm constantly writing little notes to members of staff. You know, if I find out that one of their wife's mums passed, or one of their wife's mums in hospital, or one of their husband's brother had an accident, I write a little note and I send it to their home address. I drive HR mad because obviously they can't just go giving out home addresses all the time. So I'm like, I'll send this to you, you send it to them. But I think it enables people to realize that just because you're quick thinking, on your feet, quite short of time, when they see you in a business environment, it's not who you are. So I think it's something that I really enjoy doing, and a few of my management team have mentioned it on occasions that it really means a lot to them.
That's so powerful. Do you set time aside for that on a weekly basis? Like, do you have an hour on a Friday where you dedicate to writing thank yous or passing those, or is it just ad hoc as and when the situation arises?
Yeah, it's ad hoc and it's that situation, but I do it a lot. So, I mean, I write notes to my wife. We've just moved home this week, actually, and I wrote a note to my wife to say, you did a fantastic job this week with the kids while managing the kids while we did this. Thank you so much. It means the world. Just little things like that. I leave notes whenever I leave the country for work. I will leave. I will go to the printer, grab 10 pieces of A4, and I'll write a word on each one, and I'll leave them all the way down the staircase, all the way leading to the breakfast hall for my children. I'll leave my wife little post-its on the mirror, just stuff like that. This is happening every day, but it's happening every month, where it means something. But it's not planned, it's not thought of. It's just ingrained in me now that people appreciate it. It's a nice thing to do.
Well, the females out there listening to this, Jimmy, you've got the rest of us males in a lot of trouble.
Set the bar. Yeah.
Oh no, Rob, we can cut the video. We can cut the recording just 5 minutes prior to that last question. Before we move into the close, Jimmy, who really impressed you? Of all of the interviews, who kind of blew your mind?
think I have to say I was very, very lucky. Right, I interviewed 13 people, ranging from US print billionaire Paul Fuller to Sir Charles Dunstan, UK telecoms billionaire here. I only knew one of them before I started the interviews, which was Duncan Ballantyne. But they all invited me into their homes. They all gave me unlimited access, and not one of them had any editing rights over the books, and none of them have seen the book until they received their printed copy. So I feel very, very fortunate for that. And they all in some way had a mark on me. Paul Orfalea, for those that don't know him, he set up an organization called Kinko Print in America with a $2,500 loan when he was at university, and set it up in the shopping mall outside his first university. He went on to sell that for over $4 billion. Somewhat 30, 40 years later. And I went and spent some time with Paul in Santa Barbara in the US. He was the one person that I spent this time with, and it was like looking at myself. I was like, he's straight talking, he's quite big, stocky build. He was just, cut through all of the nonsense, get to the point. And I really loved my time with him. We spent all day together, lunch together, into the evening. But the one person that really struck me as being different to what I expected was Kelly Hoppen, the interior designer. And Kelly was simply wonderful, one of the nicest people I have ever had the pleasure of meeting. I just loved the interview. And a great story on Kelly is I reached out to Kelly to interview, and she said absolutely, etc., etc. So I gave her we got the date and time in, and then I happened another dyslexic thinking moment. I had booked it in while I was on holiday with the family and children, and I thought, well, you just go, right? I'll leave the children in the morning, I'll be back in the evening, I'll get back for the interview. So I book my flights, etc., etc. I get to the airport. When I'm sat at the airport, also on the taxi on my way to the airport, I'm looking through my diary to make sure I've got her address and stuff like that. And I can't find the diary invite. So I go back to the email. I've got my own note in there, interview Kelly, but I haven't got the official invite. So I go back through the emails, etc., etc. Well, I've got the wrong day. I'm heading to the airport the day before I'm supposed to be interviewing her. So then I'm like, it's going to be the wrong day. It's tomorrow. But tomorrow, we and the family are heading from where we are to another destination by boat. There are no flights the following day. So now I have to make a decision. Do I fly into London now on this flight anyway, stay there for a night, can't get back to my children, so it's 3 days away from my children on my 10-day holiday? Well, I wasn't willing to do that. So I got to the airport, got out the taxi, thought, what am I going to do? And I thought, I'm going to call her. So I call Kelly's mobile and I go, Kelly, I'm at the airport. I'm a day early. This is what's wrong. And she said, darling, these things happen. Go and enjoy being with your children. Put another date in when I'm back, when you're back. A week later, I turned up with a bottle of champagne to say sorry and interviewed her. But she was the most remarkable, soft, thoughtful, emotionally intelligent person that I've ever interviewed. And she was just delightful.
Is there anything that surprised you about the dyslexic thinkers out there, the explorers out there, that you didn't know about yourself, but through the course of the interviews, it essentially held a mirror and you had an insight as to actually nobody's called that out before, but yes, of course, that's the way I've behaved in certain situations.
Yes, definitely. So it's the sense of injustice. So once we started interviewing people, I saw very quickly that almost everybody had got this real grudge against injustice. If they saw injustice, they had to do something about it. And it led to most of them starting businesses. But in other fashions, you know, Kelly Hoppen talks in the book about how she was arrested and thrown into jail while in South Africa for having some friends stay in her hotel because Black people weren't allowed to stay in the same hotels as white people at the time. Duncan Bannatyne talks about how he got, you know, thrown in jail in the Navy for hitting someone who had been rude to him and had constantly tried to bully him. But this sense of injustice and having to do something about it has led to many dyslexic thinkers setting up businesses in those fields to actually go and do something about it. So Duncan Bannatyne's with care homes, Sir Charles Dunstan's with how small businesses weren't able to get mobile phone contracts because everybody was only focused on the people with 50 or 100 users more. It was that real sense of, hey, how dare you? I'm going to do something about that. And I realized that when I entered the debt recovery industry, as you mentioned early on, the first few weeks into that industry, I remember going home and clearly thinking, these people are terrorizing people for money with the authority of the UK government. Do you leave or do you do something about it? And I decided to do something about it. But it was that sense of injustice for the people like me, the people that grew up in 2-bedroom flats in East London, the people that were being terrorized, that made me want to change that industry. And I went on to change that industry, you know, got new regulations implemented, got the whole branding, introduced the first ever accredited training scheme through City and Guilds. We completely eradicated that bad behavior and made big changes, which ultimately led to me being where I am today.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I recall you sharing that with me during our last interview, that you went into this industry. It was an industry that you didn't like. You wanted to change it specifically. You didn't call it injustice at that point, and that rings so loudly now. And the fact that that's a trait that you've seen amongst all of these successful explorers is incredible. So, as we move into the close, what would you say to the leaders listening? What advice can you give them before we move into our timeless takeaways? What advice can you give people to create more diverse cultures within their organizations? And maybe how will they know now, as they look out within their organization, that it's not diverse, and ultimately they're limiting the potential of their teams and their organizations as a result?
Yeah. Well, in specific relation to dyslexia, I mean, Microsoft, LinkedIn Learning have been brilliant on this over the last few years, instigated by a charity called Made by Dyslexia, uh, and a lady called Kate Griggs. But on your LinkedIn profile now, you can add dyslexic thinking as a skill, and that has been a game changer. And before I started writing this book, there were about 11,000 people that had added that. As we sit here today, there's over 100,000. So immediately, businesses and organization and leaders should promote that there are people in their organization, especially those in senior positions, add it to their LinkedIn profile if they are, because then we start to change the narrative from this being a weakness to being a potential strength. And one of the things that I really love, and I did a podcast with SAP, the large technology company, quite recently, and they have gone and implemented this now, is I said, you know, my email signature says, expect small typos, but big ideas, dyslexic thinker. And I would promote that everybody does that, because what we need to do is we need to realize that it really doesn't matter if there's a small typo in the social media post or the letter or the email. Let's more worry about what the messaging is. And I think that as a leader, we should promote that. And then we can start to map, well, do we have any neurodiversity in our organization? Because if we don't, then do we want it? Should we have it? And I think if you read the Dyslexic Edge, the evidence on should you have it is clearly there, and it's a yes. And then you can start to think about recruiting for it. And what I would like to see, and I've not seen it once yet, Brendan, is I would like to see the first job advert go out actively looking for a dyslexic thinker.
Yeah. What you're saying is us type A closeted perfectionists have to get over ourselves and not get snagged on the typo in the CV. So I love it. Jimmy, you know, as a previous guest, we have a tradition on this show with a closing question. You have such incredible wisdom, and even more given the last 12, 18 months that you've had interviewing incredible entrepreneurs, those who are exemplars of scaling with purpose across the globe. Can you share with our audience 3 timeless takeaways?
Yeah, absolutely. Mine won't surprise you, but to be kind, it's really important in not only in today's world, but it will pay you much dividends later on in life. My second one is to be useful, and not just to others, but to yourself. Stop planning for everything, actually start doing. And my third one is to pay yourself first. Really do consider your personal well-being, your family's well-being, and how you conduct yourself around that environment before you get going for your day and interact with others.
Oh, I love those. Absolutely succinct and profound. Love it. The book is released on September the 12th. I encourage all of our listeners to go out and grab a copy. It's brilliant to see a book like this written by an incredible entrepreneur who thinks differently and bringing this thinking to the masses. So really well done, you. So beyond the promotion of the book, what's next for you?
More of the same. It wouldn't surprise you. I mean, I love what I do. More startups, more scale-ups, a few more things within the charitable sector, and yeah, ultimately a few more promotions of the book. And really, you know, for me, it's about changing the narrative that's currently supports dyslexia. So I'm excited to be doing more of the same.
Brilliant. Well done, Jamie. If people want to get in touch and learn more about your work, how best to do that? How best to reach you?
LinkedIn. So I don't use any other social media platforms, but you can find me on LinkedIn or on my own website, jamiewaller.co.uk, and do reach out. And if there's any of your listeners or viewers that happens to do that first job advert, please send it to me. I would like to see it for actively searching for a dyslexic thinker.
Absolutely. Look, you've been an absolute star today. I love speaking with you. The last 60, 70 minutes absolutely flown. Thank you for bringing such wonderful energy. a different perspective today, and being kind in terms of the way you deliver your message. It's you've been very patient with me and my questions, so I want to thank you, and thanks also to your wonderful support there, Amelie, who's in the background. Well done, Amelie, for supporting your dad today. So brilliant.
She's been very, very patient while
Well
trying
done.
to convince me to buy a dog.
I think she deserves the dog now at this stage, Jimmy. So well done, Amelie.
I'll
Brilliant.
consider it. Give him a wave.
Super. Jimmy, thank you
you
so much. Take care.
Always enjoyed it. Thank you.